This is the introduction to section 4.1, congruent figures. One objective here with section 4.1 as we start a new unit is to recognize congruent figures and their parts. We're going to talk about what congruent figures are and how you are able to identify them. So, congruent figures have the same size and the same shape. When two figures are congruent, you can slide it, flip it, turn one so that it fits exactly on the other, as shown below. In this lesson, you'll learn how to determine if geometric figures are congruent. So, again, they give you an example here of two rectangles. We can slide it up. These two are congruent. They're the same. I could flip it over. In this case, I flipped it over. Or I could rotate it or turn it. They call it turn, but I would call it rotate if I rotate it over. These two are congruent. Okay. Now, you can determine whether two figures are congruent by comparing their corresponding parts. Now, we talked about corresponding parts in Unit 1, and really the definition of corresponding parts was, and it was really corresponding angles that are in the same position. Well, corresponding parts are parts that are in the same position. Okay, congruent figures. Definition: congruent polygons have congruent corresponding parts, matching their sides and angles. Okay? When you name congruent polygons, you must list corresponding vertices in the same order. And I'm going to highlight this point, and you may want to underline this on your notes. You must list corresponding vertices in the same order. Now, a couple things here. These are the sides. These are the angles. And yes, as you notice as you look at the picture here, on the picture, these are not exactly in the same position. Okay, so this one here is flipped compared to that one, the one on the left. Now, another way to do this, and the way I personally think is easier, is to list out the names like they've done here. Okay, so they've listed the polygon. ABCD is congruent to EFGH. Okay, and what you do now is you'll match up first two letters with first two letters, second two letters with second two letters, so forth and so on. So you'll notice here, for the sides, they match A, B, and EF. And what I usually do is once I mark them, I'll mark them with a 1. So A, B, and EF are congruent. And notice, you can't flip your letters. You can't change them because they have to be in the specific order. So first two letters and first two letters. And then they go BC and they go FG. So BC and FG. Okay. And again, you'll notice as you look here at these, again, as you look here, B to C and F to G, they're in order every time. AB is in order, EF. Okay, if I choose to go BA, then I would have to go FE if I flip them. Okay, so those are all the sides. Again, and then the last side is DA and HE, as you can tell here. Those are the four sets of sides. Now, angles are a little easier because angles, in this case, you're only going to have to use one letter. So, in this case, angle A matches up with angle E. Angle B matches up with angle F. C matches up with angle G, and D matches up with angle H. Those are congruent. The angles that are in the same position are congruent to each other. So, in order to be congruent figures, they have to have all their sides and all their angles that are in corresponding positions congruent to each other. Okay, now as we look at these examples here, and we're finding corresponding parts, or finding congruent figures and corresponding parts, what I want you to do is take a look at this first figure here as I zoom in, and what are the congruent corresponding parts. So what I want you to do is be able to hit pause, and I want you to list the corresponding sides and the corresponding angles that have to be congruent in order for these two shapes to be congruent. So go ahead and hit pause, and then come back, and we can look through your answers. Okay, now that you've hit pause and you've come up with some answers, What I want you to do now is take a look at what we have and what you have. So the sides that are congruent, as I look at this set of names up here, okay? As I look at this set of names, I'm going to start with the sides, and I'm just going to use my letters in order. So if I start with HI, HI has to be congruent. First two letters have to be congruent to first two letters, so it's going to be LM. And then I go IJ, and that has to be congruent to MN, second two letters. And then I go JK, has to be congruent to NO. And then the last one, if I go KH, has to be congruent to OL. Those are the sides that must be congruent to each other in order for the corresponding sides, in order for them to be congruent. Now let's take a look at the angles. Angle H is going to be congruent to angle L. And again, I'm looking at the first letters here, okay? I'm looking at the first letters. So when I look at the first letters on here, look at the first letters here, I'm matching these guys up, H and L. Angle I is congruent to angle M. Those are matched up. Those are the second letters. Angle J is congruent to angle N. That's the third letter. And then the last two letters are angle K is congruent to angle O. Okay? So in order for these two shapes to be congruent, all of those have to be true. The sides have to be congruent to each other, and the angles have to be congruent to each other. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at the other example now. The second example, are the triangles congruent, and then justify your answer. Okay, so in order for the triangles to be congruent, again, all the sides that are the same, in the same position, and all the angles that are in the same position have to be congruent. So the corresponding parts have to be congruent. So what I want you to do, hit pause and see if you can come up with the correct sides and the correct angles to match up to see if these two shapes are congruent. Okay, now that you have hit pause and come up with your list, let's take a look at it now. Now, this one's different because this one doesn't show you the names of the shapes at the top. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make sure that you match up your markings properly. So the same markings, okay, have to be put together. So for example, as you're looking at this, you see a tick mark. Let's start with sides. So I see a 1 tick mark and a 1 tick mark. So I know that these two sides are equal to each other, but I got to name them properly. I have to name them in the correct order. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to go, you'll notice you have angle marks on both of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with the single angle mark to the second angle mark. So I'm going to say AB on the left triangle is congruent to then, in this case, since I went single mark to double mark, I have to do the same thing. So ED. AB and ED are congruent. Okay, so the same thing with the other sides. I see a 4 and a 4. So now I'm going to go 2 markings to no markings. So this would be BC is congruent. If I went 2 markings to no markings, again I got to go 2 markings to no markings. So this would be DC. And then the third side, I'm going to look for the 6s now, the 6s, and as I look at my angle markings, I'm going to go single angle marking to no angle marking. So I would say AC is congruent, and I went single marking to no marking, so it would have to be EC. Those are the 3 sides that are congruent. Now the angles. The angle markings are a little bit easier because all I have to do is find the markings that are the exact same and name them. So that has a single, that has a single. So angle A is congruent to angle E. This one has a double, that one has a double. So angle B is congruent to angle D. And then the last one, the ones that don't have a marking here. Now on these two, I actually have to name them in 3 letters because angle C could apply to both of those. So I'm going to say angle BCA is congruent. Now, I went 2 to 0 to 1 marking on the angles. I have to do the same thing. 2 to 0 to 1 marking. Your markings matter, so then this is DCE, angle DEC. Okay. So, I know that these triangles are congruent because all the sides and all the angles are congruent. So now I want to actually say this. So we use the little triangle symbol to denote its triangle, and I'm going to call the first one ABC. Triangle ABC is congruent to which triangle? Now, does it matter? Sure it does, because I have to have my proper markings. I'm going to go angle markings 1 to 2 to 0, since I went ABC, 1 to 2 to 0. So here I have to go 1 to 2 to 0. So my triangle is going to be EDC. So as I mark this here, this is going to be triangle EDC. Okay, this concludes 4.1, part 1. Don't forget to complete your WSQ at the end.